Moving on to Unit 2, Metabolism. So this unit, I really advise you on this one to try and take it even more so in bits and pieces than you maybe do with neuromuscular. Okay, with metabolism, the concepts, they do get a little more challenging, but not so much more than the neuromuscular. It's just there's a lot of things that are going on. There's a lot of different aspects are taking place at once. So it's very easy to get confused. And it does get difficult sometimes to learn it because of the complexity of metabolism, all the things coming in kind of all at once. So like I said, not necessarily that the concepts are vastly more difficult than what we did in neuromuscular. It's just there's a lot of different things taking place, I guess. Okay, so I say with this, take each energy system we talk about. What is it? What do you get from it? The pros and cons for each one. And then just don't try and do more than just that itself. Okay, a lot of times what students do is they try to learn everything about an energy system, and that's not what I'm trying to get at with here. I just want you to be able to know, all right, we have this energy system. This is what you get from it. These are the pros and cons. Okay. And don't try and add in more than what we talk about. So that's going to be the first part of the unit. Second part we'll be talking about is what fuel source do we use during exercise? What's the right one? And how do we switch between the different fuel sources? Okay. And so the hard part about metabolism is the second part of the lecture is really the important things that we actually need to know. That is whether you're going to be a coach to any, a PT to anyone within our field. It's always good to know what fuel source do you use for during exercise. Okay, that's the practical aspect of the unit. But to get to that point, you have to know all the science. You have to know the energy systems. You have to know what composes the energy systems. So unfortunately, it's kind of one of those things where the practical stuff is only going to be used if you know the detailed aspects of it, the scientific part of it, the energy systems, what goes into all of them. So I urge, once again, take these energy systems bit by bit by bit, break them apart. Don't try and add in more than what we talk about because that'll only confuse you. And then at that point, once you understand the basics of them, then we get into the practical aspects. What fuel source do we use during exercise? How does intensity? How does duration of exercise? What type of exercise? How does that all impact what fuel source we use? Okay, those are the things that are what's really important in our field is the practical part of that. Okay, so don't, like I said, take steps. It gets confusing, but if you break it down, simplify it, then you'll learn a lot better and it won't be as daunting as you kind of maybe have heard metabolism be or you think it might be from there. Okay? To start, define exercise metabolism. What we'll be looking at here is the study of how the body provides the energy necessary to generate the desired power output. So going back to what we've talked about in the previous unit with neuromuscular, the goal of the neuromuscular unit was to talk about how do we produce power, because power generation then transmits into a movement. We're only able to move if we generate enough power to allow for movement to occur. Okay, and so that was the goal of neuromuscular, is to look at then that power generation. Moving on to metabolism now is the metabolic unit or the metabolism in general is where power is being maintained due to the energy being produced for that. That is, with metabolism, we're looking at how do we produce the energy that then allows the power generation to continue on. Okay, I always use the NASCAR example. Well, the neuromuscular unit is, think of the neuromuscular unit as the engine and the car itself. Okay, power is generated within the engine. Okay, once that power is generated, or enough power is generated, then it turns into then a movement. Wheels start to turn and the car starts to move. Metabolism is basically the driver. The driver is controlling the car where it goes. Right, left, straight ahead. You're not going to back up in NASCAR, but the driver's steering the car where it needs to go. And that's what metabolism is doing. Is just providing the energy that keeps the neuromuscular unit going. And so with that, once power is not able to be maintained, that's what we refer to as fatigue. I said in neuromusculars, when force or power declines, that's the definition of fatigue. And so when metabolism cannot keep the power going, cannot provide the energy that keeps generating the power within the muscles, that's when you fatigue out. And there's 4 major sites we've already talked about, but once again, the 4 major sites of ATP hydrolysis. Remember, hydrolysis, the hydro-water olysis to break apart because water is involved in the breaking apart of ATP. So that's what we'll use that word. I'll also use breakdown. I'll use a couple different terms in terms of breaking apart ATP, but hydrolysis is the main term we use. But the 4 spots is cross-bridge cycle, the sarcoplasmic reticulum pumps, the SR calcium pumps, the sarcolemma sodium potassium pump, and the neuromembrane sodium potassium pump. So remember, ATP is used as a cross-bridge, the calcium pump, and then the sodium potassium pump of the muscle and the nerve. Those are the 4 spots. Primarily, about 75% of it's used at the cross-bridge cycle itself. So it says, does ATP depletion cause fatigue? And once again, fatigue is defined as a loss in force and or power. That's the definition of fatigue. But what we're wanting to know here is, does losing ATP cause that fatigue? Well, I'm going to kind of explain this a little bit right now. So it says cost of walking, and this is just an example. So this example won't be on the exam. This is just a kind of start open up your mind to how metabolism actually works. Okay, so it says a cost of walking, it says take 6 kcals per minute. If you want to walk for 15 minutes, you need 90 kcals of energy. ATP contains 10 kcals per mole. And you got 90 kcals divided by 10 kcals per mole gives you 9 moles of ATP needed to walk 15 minutes. Moles is just a unit of measure. It says 1 mole of ATP weighs about 500 grams. So it says 9 moles times 500 grams gives you 4,500 grams of ATP needed to walk 15 minutes. So that's how much ATP you need just to walk for 15 minutes in terms of a dry weight. It says 0.005 moles of ATP per kg of muscle, just due to cell volume limitations. So if you take 9 moles, divide by 0.005, gives you 1,800 kilograms of muscle needed to walk 15 minutes. So about 2 tons of muscle needed to walk. So what this is saying is that in order to walk just for 15 minutes, you need to be able to store about 2 tons. You need to weigh about 2 tons of just pure muscle, because that's the only way you could actually store just enough ATP in order to walk just a simple walk of 15 minutes. Okay, so what this is highlighting is that the depletion of ATP, we always think that that's what causes fatigue. We just lose ATP. But really what it comes down to is when you're dealing with metabolism is the overall collective of all the different reactions taking place within the cell. And so what causes fatigue is not necessarily that you lose ATP. It's just simply that the ATP resynthesis cannot keep up with the rate of breakdown. And so that's really when you get to metabolism, that's what should be summed up as, is that you fatigue out and force and power goes down because you cannot build ATP up as fast as you're breaking it down. Because like I said, metabolism is the overall area of looking at all the reactions taking place, and that's what the body's made up of, is just nonstop reactions taking place all the time. And so when we're looking at metabolism, this unit, it needs to be looked at how fast can we build ATP up versus how fast we break it down. And like the example above, since we don't, that's showing us that we need to store a lot of ATP, that is, have a lot of muscle in order to be able to keep those reactions going like that. But we don't have that much muscle. So how do we maintain the cell? Well, we need to be able to build ATP up just as fast as we're breaking it down. And so keep this word in mind right here. You can see at the bottom of the slide right here, it says rate, R-A-T-E. So it says fatigue occurs when the rate of ATP resynthesis, so the rate of rate is how fast are we doing something. So that is how fast we're building ATP up versus the rate of ATP usage. That is breakdown or hydrolysis. So fatigue occurs when the rate of ATP resynthesis is less than that and less than the rate of ATP usage. Okay, so it's, like I said, it's not how much necessarily, it's all about the speed of reactions taking place. Okay, so this is just trying to bring up the point right now, start getting an understanding that metabolism, to maintain what we're doing, we need to be building up faster than we're breaking down in terms of ATP. Okay, so just remember the word rate. So it's the rate of resynthesis versus the rate of hydrolysis. That's what sums up basically metabolism in terms of exercise metabolism. It says sustaining human life depends upon continual replenishment of ATP. As long as we're alive, we're always going to be replenishing that. Okay, the only time we don't replenish ATP is when we deceased. So it says increase in metabolic rate requires an increase in ATP resynthesis. So when you start to exercise, well, the need for resynthesis increases. That's because the rate of hydrolysis is increasing as well. It says as exercise intensity increases, ATP production must match the energy requirement or the power output cannot be sustained. Okay, so just keep that in mind. Just when we're dealing with exercise, well, really at all times during life, we're looking at synthesis versus hydrolysis. At rest, we're able to resynthesize way faster than we hydrolyze ATP. Okay, but as intensity goes up, as duration goes up of exercise, then therefore the ATP resynthesis, ATP hydrolysis increases faster than ATP resynthesis. And so that's why we have to increase metabolic rate, therefore, to match those demands right there. And you see right here, there's 3 slopes on this graph. And what this is saying is if there's 3 slopes, that means and this is looking at, like I said, speed of running, time of running, and then looking at how fast basically we're able to perform the running and for how long. And from that, they found, well, there's 3 slopes, so therefore there must be 3 energy units. And there are. So we have the immediate system, the glycolytic, and then the oxidative system. And that's what this is showing right here, is those 3 slopes. One is, you see the very first one's not very long time of running, but the speed, which means we have one energy system that's very, very fast, but doesn't last long. You got one in the middle that is still pretty fast, but doesn't last quite as long. And then the last one you see on the far right, well, it lasts a lot longer, but you're not getting much. When you see speed, you can also say, like, if you're running faster, you're producing more power. There's a good way to kind of look at that. So that last unit right there, the power output's not as much, but it goes a lot longer. And those are really the 3 distinctive characteristics of the 3 energy systems themselves. Like I said, We got the immediate. That's the term I use. You also have ATP PCR. I'll talk about that here in a sec. The non-oxidative is the glycolytic system. I'm not sure why. Well, non-oxidative is because it's within the glycolytic system. There's many pathways where when you start to break down glucose, because that's what glycolate means, break down a glycogen, there's a couple pathways you go into. And so the non-oxidative, remember the immediate, the ATP PCR, the glycolytic system, those are our anaerobic systems, so without oxygen. But I used glycolytic instead of non-oxidative, but the non-oxidative term is just more or less an anaerobic system, but then there's capability for go within into the aerobic system. We'll get into that coming up here in a little bit. And then the last one, you can see oxidative, oxidative phosphorylation, our aerobic system, a lot of different terms kind of for that right there. But going back to that slide right before this one and this one, both are just highlighting the fact that we have 3 different energy systems to maintain ATP balance. Maintain ATP balance, aka ATP buffering. These systems differ in the rate of ATP resynthesis. You can see the relative energy potential of each system on the vertical axis, and then on the horizontal, you got down there the time. So you can see the immediate system says very little. Within a short amount of time, the immediate system has a high amount of contribution of energy to maintaining this ATP buffering balance. And then the non-oxidative, so glycolytic, can maintain the energy contribution a little bit longer, but then that doesn't last, only for a short amount of time. Whereas the oxidative, the longer we start to exercise, the more and more greater contribution of energy that system's being able to produce. And that's, all 3 of these systems at all times are being used. Okay, it's not during short exercise, this system's used, the other 2 are turned off, and then vice versa. But rather, at all times, these systems are always being used. It's just which one has the primary contribution of ATP replenishment. If one of these systems stops working, then that's death at that point. You can't survive without one of these energy systems. So they're always working. It's just which one is providing the greatest contribution to ATP, to the ATP balance. Like it says, therefore, the primary cause of fatigue is the inability to match the rate of ATP resynthesis versus the rate of ATP hydrolysis. When you fatigue, power output slows down until it can match an ATP resynthesis rate. Just keep that in mind. Just the rate of ATP, what rate we're talking about with that is just basically how fast something is going. So as how fast ATP resynthesis is compared to how fast ATP hydrolysis is. Just keep that in mind, that relationship there. So the maximal power and capacity of the 3 energy systems. So you look at the immediate, glycolysis, and oxidative. Immediate system has a great amount of power. However, the capacity is very little. Glycolysis, less power than the immediate system, but a greater capacity, stored capacity. Or the oxidative is very little max power, however, great capacity and storage. So going back to neuromuscular, remember one of the key things of the muscle fiber types is type 1, type 2A, and type 2X. Type 1 is the fatigue resistant, the oxidative capacity. Type 2 is, type 2A is fatigable, but not as much as type 2X. Type 2A has a little bit more fatigue resistant, than type 2X. Well, your type 2A fibers and your type 2X. One is that they have a lot of glycolytic, a lot of immediate energy systems in there. That's what makes, once again, definite characteristics of that. But your type 2A will start to take on the oxidative as well. So reason why we say all those terms about those muscle and the fiber typing is, well, when we describe them like that, we're describing, well, one, the protein makeup of those muscles, but then also the metabolic makeup of those muscles as well. So that's how all these are starting to tie together a little bit. Okay, so if you're looking at these muscles and the energy systems with them, well, we talk about the immediate system has a high power output, which if you're a power athlete, you want to be more type 2X fiber typing as much as possible. So that's the benefit. However, working at its fastest rate, it doesn't last that long. And so with the immediate system, the ATP PCR, that's all the terms we'll be using for that. That system right there, working at its fastest rate, can only last about 20 seconds, maybe 30 seconds the most if you're super, super trained. But for the most part, about 20 seconds is all before that system begins to slow down. Glycolysis, if you look at the max power to the max capacity, it's almost a 1-to-1 rate or ratio right there. So working at its fastest rate, the glycolytic system can only last about a minute. And then the oxidative system, working at its fastest rate, if you look at the power compared to the capacity, could last multiple minutes. That is, up to a couple hours, working at its fastest rate. Okay, so with energy systems, the first thing is always go to not so much the time, because everyone always does that with metabolism. They always go, well, if I'm working, 30 seconds, I'm doing a lot of immediate and glycolytic. Well, all comes back to how hard you're working. Okay, if I'm shuffling my feet for 30 seconds, that's going to be much different metabolically speaking than an all-out cycled sprint for 30 seconds. Okay, so always when you're looking at metabolism, always go to first how hard you're working, the intensity, and then you go to the duration. So if I'm working as hard as I possibly can, then I could probably know, like, let's say I'm doing all-out sprints for 20 seconds, then I know that I'm pretty much using all immediate, the energy contribution come from the immediate system at that point. So always go intensity first before you go to duration. So remember, all three metabolic systems are operating at all times. You can see right here, here's just basically the relative contribution. So if I'm doing a 100-meter sprint, at that point, it's 100% anaerobic in terms of contribution there. If I'm doing a marathon, it's 100% aerobic. Okay, but you can kind of see that for most things outside those extremes, there is a massive overlap of all the energy systems. Okay, so that comes down to then how do you train? Well, this is why strength coaches become so important, is because they need to know the demands of the athlete, demands of the sport, and then from there, going to then how to tailor a program to hit on all these aspects. So there's, well, if I'm training, doing like the 200 or 400, well, I know that I have some glycolytic aspect in there, maybe a little bit oxidative at that point. You know what I mean? So yeah, that's a lot of sprinting for the 200 or 400, but there's still, you need to have aerobic base built up with that as well. Okay, if you're an Olympic lifter, you need to do zero aerobic work. Just lift and that's it. Same thing with a sprinter. Or if you're running, 800 to all the way up to the 5K, if those points right there, it's mostly aerobic, but you need to also have some anaerobic capabilities as well. Okay, so outside the extremes, for the most part, there's a massive overlap of all the energy systems. But even on the extremes, though, it doesn't mean that the energy systems are not working. It just means the contribution. Okay, even doing a marathon, or 100-meter sprint, all systems are all working all the time. It's just we're looking at the contribution. So one doesn't actually stop working. It's just what is the percent contribution. And so always I keep going back because I keep trying to drill this in. The rate of a particular system and its relative contribution varies with the work demand. That is, how hard you're working will always determine what system is the primary energy system. You got factors affecting the control of metabolic systems and pathways. So first thing is the concentration of the substrate. I'll be using this term a lot, but a substrate is basically the fuel source. Substrate will be carbohydrates, fats, proteins, creatine phosphate. Those are the main ones that we'll talk about. When I talk about proteins, remember, amino acids make up them, so I'll use a lot of these terms interchangeably, but we'll just make sure you know if I'm talking about protein, I'm really talking about the amino acids. If I'm talking about carbohydrates, I'm really talking about glycogen or glucose. Remember, glycogen is the storage form of carbohydrates in the human body. Plants use starch, mammals use glycogen. And then glucose is, well, glycogen is just made up of thousands of glucose molecules. Glucose is the simplest sugar broken down into the body. And then fats, we'll use the term lipids, which are then broken into triglycerides and triglycerides, glycerol, and fatty acids. So those are all the terms right there in terms of substrates for that. And then creatine phosphate is in the immediate system. And so those are the four main substrates we'll talk about. Substrate, once again, is just the fuel source. Then you got concentration of the enzymes. Remember, I said metabolism is just the collective of all the reactions taking place within the cell. Reactions occur only via enzymes. Enzymes speed up or slow down reactions, and they help reactions take place. And so substrates are only going to be turned into ATP if you have the available enzymes. Such as, I'm only going to break down creatine phosphate into ATP or fat or lipids, I should say, glucose, any of that if there's an enzyme present. If there's no enzymes present, then no reaction will occur. So enzymes always go along with substrates. So they go hand in hand right there. Okay, so remember, what's going to affect the metabolic system? Well, if there's no substrate, there's going to be no reaction taking place. If there's substrate and there's enzyme, then we will. Here, number 3, you got the concentration of cofactors or coenzymes. One is NAD. NAD is nicotine, amide, adenine, dinucleotide. And what this is in glycolysis and also in the Krebs cycle. This is where this is being produced, because what this is doing is this is accepting a hydrogen through the process of glycolysis and the oxidative system, Krebs cycle, and then NAD becomes NADH. NADH then goes to the electron transport system. And at that point, there's where ATP is being produced in the ETC. We'll get to that all coming up here in a little bit. These are all things I know you've heard before. But without a presence of NAD, so the nicotine, amide, adenine, dinucleotide, if there's none of that available because it's needed in glycolysis and the Krebs cycle to function, if that's not available, then the entire energy system will slow down. Okay, so some of these cofactors are needed, are just in process of metabolism, and without them, then they will slow down and not work properly. Then you got the velocity of the enzyme reaction. So there's some enzymes, one in glycolysis, PFK, phosphofructokinase. That enzyme is a rate limiting enzyme. That one will speed up or slow down based upon all the other molecules that are in the energy system at that point. So a lot of enzymes they all speed up. They change up the velocity of a reaction, but some are rate limiting. That is, they speed up or slow down and really are the main controllers of the energy system itself. Then you got the binding affinity of the substrate enzyme. A lot of times reactions, what will happen is if you want to slow down an energy system, then you'll have another molecule attached on the enzyme that will slow down the entire reaction. Or sometimes they'll speed up based upon what is needed. All these are being maintained by, this is a capacitive delivery system. That is primarily the cardiovascular system. That's going to really help bring out, you can see number 7, end products. So bring out the bad, deliver the good to maintain the overall state of the cell to keep all these reactions taking place and moving forward. Okay, so there's a lot that goes into metabolic systems. Okay, how much substrate's available, enzymes, the cofactors, how fast these enzymes are taking place, and then how well are we able to clear out the bad, the waste products, and then bring in the good nutrients that's needed to keep everything going. Okay, so as we're moving forward these energy systems, just pay attention to what I'm talking about. Okay, and don't try and add in too much on here. Okay, so just know, like, okay, what are the main products? What's the enzyme? Or actually, sorry, what are the main reactants? What's the enzyme? What's the product? Pros and cons of each one. And that'll help you out understand this and keep it simplified. So that was the introduction to metabolism. Remember, with metabolism, we're dealing with rate. The rate of ATP resynthesis versus the rate of ATP hydrolysis. Okay, that's what's going to determine what energy system has the primary contribution in energy replenishment. Okay, and it's able to maintain that ratio is what allows you to then keep working at that same level. But it's when the energy system cannot maintain that is when you start to switch to the different energy systems. That is, if the immediate system cannot maintain ATP resynthesis versus hydrolysis, you'll start to become more glycolytic, and at that point, you'll switch and become then oxidative. However, one thing we'll start getting into these energy systems now is as you switch, that also means you're slowing down as well. Okay, the oxidase system is a slow system. It's a reactive system, but that's what really keeps us alive. That's the energy system that maintains cellular respiration, and that's what maintains life for us as humans. However, it's a slow system. So if you're wanting to go fast or high power, that's not the system to use. So, but as you start to fatigue out, you start to switch, and as you become more oxidative, you are slowing down at that point. You start to switch between that. So to wrap this introduction up, with metabolism, you're looking at the rate of ATP resynthesis versus the rate of ATP hydrolysis. If that ratio is maintained, you'll stay in the same energy system. If not, you'll start to switch to match demands. But a lot of times what's happening then too is you're then slowing down as well. So moving on to then the next units, just keep that in mind. Like I said, the pros and cons of each unit. Know what the reactants are, that is, substrates, the enzymes, and what the products. What do you get from that? Okay, so we'll get into the immediate, then we'll go to glycolytic, and then we'll get into then the oxidative system.